Good evening, guys. It's great to be with you again today, and I'm excited for today's lecture and our weekly unit on American progressivism. I find that this is one of the most interesting of all the different subjects because here we're starting to move away from simply looking at the debates surrounding the creation of the Constitution and the purposes of government, and we're starting to look at theories and doctrines and political practices that start to give us more of an explanation for why our government looks the way it does today. So this will undoubtedly be a very helpful unit to you, not only as you do your last assignments, but also as you try to think through the debates that surround us and contemporary arguments related to the relevance of the founding for today. I've tried to make the case to you that the founding is good, that the framing of the Constitution and that the creation of the Constitution ultimately was rooted in insights about human nature and the purposes of government that we ought not to lose sight of. The dangers of pure majority faction, the importance of a limited government. These kinds of principles that we saw were on the minds of both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And so today we're going to be looking at a very different group of thinkers and statesmen whose ideas in some ways could be seen as quite alien to those of the American founders. Some interesting points to keep in mind that are more related to class procedure than the topic at hand that you'd be interested in knowing. You ought remember that we are approaching the very end of the class. This is week 9. Week 10 is your final week. So we're getting ever so close to your final research paper that is based on the presentation you submitted to me this week. So please keep that on your radar, keep it on your agenda, because that final project is going to be a very big portion of your final grade, and you need to do well on it. The other assignments you should have on your radar include the quiz for this week. Refer to my announcement about that. This particular quiz is going to ask several questions related to the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist-Anti-Federalist debate. So if I were you, I would look at some of your notes from our early lectures, especially the Introduction to Anti-Federalist lecture and the Political Science of the Constitution lecture. I would refer back to those notes, watch the video that is in the required content folder for this week, and you should be able to do fine on the quiz. The discussion board post is going to be much more closely connected to the Progressivism unit, and the Progressivism unit should also help you to think through some of the big concepts underlying the final paper. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move into the topic of the day. It's probably no surprise to you that one of the most striking and ubiquitous features in contemporary American politics is the language of progressivism that we hear all the time all around us. Today, as you probably know, those who call themselves progressives are usually people who are on the left of the political spectrum. And lest this be seen as something that's just, the Democrats are progressives, because that's often how we look at the American Democratic Party due to the left of center and liberal character of that party. We ought not be confused here. Within the Democratic Party, we are currently looking at a party that is undergoing a serious identity crisis. There is a debate between the very left-wing elements of that party who call themselves the progressives, right? When you hear of the members of the squad, like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, as well as people who are not in the squad but are also in the leftist camp of the Democratic Party. People like Bernie Sanders, technically an independent, but nonetheless is affiliated with the Democratic Party in many ways. Elizabeth Warren, and most recently Zohran Mamdani in New York, running for the mayorship there. These are all politicians that love to call themselves progressives. And they do not simply attack the conservatives in the Republican Party. They certainly do that. But they also attack the other Democratic Party politicians who are what we might call establishment liberals. They are progressives, to be sure, but they're of a slightly more centrist character in some ways. We see this debate playing out right now in the feud between Zohran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo in New York, representing a kind of a more centrist liberalism, or a more moderate progressivism than that offered by Mamdani the commie, as Trump likes to call him. And so progressivism is a label and an image that still is very important in our contemporary politics. And when these politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC and Mamdani call themselves progressives, they're telling us something very important about themselves, about their goals, and about their larger political philosophy. This is not simply a convenient rhetorical label that they throw on themselves, but it's a political philosophy. It's a way of thinking about the nature of government that gives them a kind of solidarity with an earlier moment in American history. This moment is the moment of American progressivism, the progressive movement. And so these politicians are calling themselves that because they want to tie themselves to these earlier American progressives. So I believe that by looking at progressivism, we're going to come to a better understanding not only of this important debate in American history, but also better understand contemporary politicians. These ideas are still alive and with us today, as the very label of progressivism and its popularity today suggests. The older progressives may be dead and gone, but many of the ideas that they promoted about the American founders, about the Constitution, and about the need to abandon the dead hand of the past and pursue new ways of thinking and practicing about American government. This is very much alive and well. And so I want us to come away from this lecture understanding what it meant to be a progressive and what it still means today. So the first thing to understand about progressivism is simply what it is. Progressivism was something like the golden age of the American left. Its precise dates have been debated and in some ways have not totally been settled in the scholarship. But scholars generally agree that it spans at least the years between the 1890s, around the time of American entry into the Spanish-American War, and 1921, when the conservative President Warren Harding was elected or ascended to the office of presidency after his election in 1920. The debates about the precise timeline of progressivism, they don't usually exclude those decades. It's always 1890s to 1920 at least. The debate has more to do with where do we start it and where do we end it, with some scholars saying maybe it's actually closer to 1860s, 1870s when it starts, if people want to connect it to Reconstruction or perhaps the Gilded Age reform movements, and other scholars dating its end in more like World War II at the end of FDR's presidency. And so, but at the very least, we know it's between the 1890s and 1920. So what was this historical movement? Well, progressivism was a movement that rose to the forefront of American politics as a reaction against perceived excesses that took place during the Gilded Age. You have to remember that in the 1870s, 1880s, and these decades, This was the time period immediately after the Second Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, you start to see giant corporations, oil barons, and great trusts emerge to the scene. This was a nation that had been proud of its relative equality of condition, where most Americans were broadly middle class. Most Americans were farmers that were largely self-employed. They didn't work for some big business, but they worked for themselves. And you didn't have mass class inequality up until this time period in the Gilded Age. And so all of a sudden, with the rise of these great corporations and big businesses, that equality of condition begins to disappear. And you start to see massive disparities of wealth. The perception seems to be that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And so new economic inequalities are starting to trouble the American people. Additionally, monopolies and trusts seem to be pervasive, and these are making it harder for many ordinary Americans to compete fairly within the free enterprise system. Many Americans start to look at the free enterprise system and wonder if it is broken. Conflicts between laborers and employers were at an all-time high, and sometimes you would have strikes that would get very violent. Mass immigration, an issue that's very much close to our own minds. Mass immigration into the big cities fueled ethnic tensions between older stock Americans who were generally from Western European backgrounds and newcomers who were coming from places like Ireland, Italy, Russia, Czechoslovakia, and all kinds of other nations. And they were bringing with them not only a different ethnic background, but also different religious views. In a nation that had been predominantly Christian and whose establishment had been largely Protestant in its religious affiliation, you're starting to see the influx of Jews and more Roman Catholics. You had already started to see some waves of Roman Catholic immigration in the early 1800s. But now immigration seems to really be transforming the culture of American life, and some Americans wonder if this is for the best. Corporations wanted their cheap labor, and politicians wanted new voters. So mass immigration continued to take place despite fears that the culture of America was in some ways changing, and the American people were losing control over it. You wouldn't be incorrect to notice that there are some similarities between this and debates about immigration today, with displacement of American kind of old stock Americans and their fears, sometimes veering in the direction of nativism, but often simply expressing this belief on their part that the newcomers are not assimilating into American life. And so that's another factor going into this progressivism, the reason for this new political movement. A last important factor was the widespread view, sometimes overblown, but sometimes this did happen, the widespread viewpoint that the politicians were basically in bed with the big businesses and they were working against American workers and American consumers. So under this theory, the politicians are legislating in such a way to help the special interests. And to many Americans, they wondered if representative government and if traditional political parties were the problem. Maybe, they felt, if we had a more directly democratic form of government, a direct democracy, or what the founders criticized as pure democracy, perhaps we can eliminate corruption, get rid of the politicians, and just let the pure of motive, pure of heart American voters make decisions about law and government by themselves. Well, in practice, we've seen that as America has become much more directly democratic, there have been actually more opportunities for special interest groups to impact our elections. And so the goal of the progressives has not in some ways lined up with the with the tangible results of their reforms. And so when I say all this, it should be obvious that the progressives, at least in this respect, they have a point. So what do they have a point about? Well, they have a point about the fact that there were real problems, right? You'd have to be a fool to look at 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s America and say, well, there were no problems at all, and there were no reasons that you would need any kind of political reforms. So I want to be clear here that the problem with progressivism is not simply the urge to clean up corruption or to make government more responsive to the people. You know, that this is sometimes how progressivism is presented to us. It's presented as a sort of a moderate reform movement that just wanted to give America back to the people against the corrupt, against the big businesses. And so I want to be clear here that there were serious and important new problems that we needed to deal with. But here's the rub. There were a lot of Americans who agreed that these problems, like mass immigration, like the power that big business sometimes had over political decision-making, and like monopolies and trusts, there were a lot of Americans who were not progressives that also thought that these were problems. So I'm thinking here of conservatives like President Calvin Coolidge and the subject of my doctoral dissertation, the nationalist conservative Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. The Lodge and Coolidge, as well as you could throw in here William Howard Taft, these were all people who accepted reform. And they were all people who worried about problems related to monopolies and immigration and corruption. What set the progressives apart from these people was not simply that they wanted to reform government and make it better. Any reasonable person would have wanted to do that. No, there was something different about them. There was a radical tone to the theory underlying progressivism. Conservatives like Lodge and Coolidge, they thought that these problems that I just mentioned could be managed from within the framework of limited government and constitutionalism. They felt that you could go through the ordinary measures of representative government, checks and balances, and federalism in order to help alleviate these problems and lift the burden on the American people. And so, for example, if you're worried about immigration, Congress ought to pass laws that are constitutional and upheld by the three branches of government. And if you're worried about monopolies, well, Congress should pass something like the Sherman Antitrust Act to rein in monopolies and restore purity to the free enterprise system. And so sometimes we have this idea that the progressives on the one hand wanted reform and the conservatives just wanted to do nothing. Well, that's not exactly right. Well, actually, it's not right at all. The conservatives were often reformers who wanted to work from within the framework of the constitutional system to improve these problems, to remedy them. The progressives, though, they were radicals at the level of theory. They wanted to basically displace the underlying philosophy of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence from their positions of preeminence in American life. This is why I have as our subtitle on this slide, Reconceiving the Purposes of Government. Progressivism was about bringing down the doctrines and philosophy of the American founders and replacing it with something new. They envisioned a new way of life, one that was much more responsive to majorities, even at the risk of allowing for what some founders would criticize as the tyranny of the majority. And they wanted a vast and powerful administrative state, which we could also tie to bureaucracy. So they believe in the need for big government, for a welfare state, for all kinds of new ways that government should be involved in the life of ordinary American citizens. And so this is what sets them apart. It's not that they saw monopolies as a problem. I would have saw them as a problem too at this time. But I would not have had the attitude, and I hope many of you would not have either, that, well, the Constitution is ultimately the problem. That's what's got to go. We're going to see that this is the theory of the progressives. So today we're going to set out to understand progressivism and its implications by looking closely at the doctrines and writings of some of the original progressives. Today we'll be looking at John Dewey. Next week we'll be studying FDR. And here's an interesting feature to understand about the progressives. And this is something that's very different from our own political culture today. So progressivism was not owned by one single political party. Whenever we think of the progressives today, we think, well, most progressives are just in the Democratic Party. Well, this was not exactly true in the early 20th century. During the original progressive movement, you have leading thinkers and intellectuals who are members of both parties. So, for example, on the foremost left side, I have in this picture lineup President Woodrow Wilson, Democrat. Right beside him, Theodore Roosevelt, Republican. Right beside him, the progressive editor and intellectual who founded the journal The New Republic, Herbert Croly, Republican. Right beside him, we have William Jennings Bryan. You may know him for the Scopes monkey trial instance, or even from the Cowardly Lion portrayal in The Wizard of Oz, which is sometimes seen as a metaphor for William Jennings Bryan. Well, Bryan was a Democrat. And beside him, you see Robert M. La Follette, who was a Republican. And so Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, Republican. And you could add to this list countless people associated with the progressive movement of both parties. And so this is simply to highlight the point that progressivism was not really a party movement. In fact, progressivism had a sort of deep-seated contempt for the two-party system and for political parties in general. They saw them as corrupt and as self-interested and as institutions that basically detracted from the pursuit of the common good. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that progressivism found ready allies within both parties. It was a movement that impacted the ideas of people who spanned both political parties. It was ubiquitous in the early 20th century. I hope that in today's lecture we're going to come to something of an understanding of why this was. We're going to look at their goals, look at their motives, and make sense of their appeal in the early 1900s. I think you will see that in many respects, the people who call themselves progressives today are not really that different at the level of first principles from their predecessors. So moving to the next slide. One important reason to study the American progressive movement is that it was majorly impactful at both the level of ideas and the level of political practice in shifting American politics away from the limited government principles of the founding and the Constitution. You've seen throughout this class, we have studied the founders, and we've looked at both anti-federalists and federalists and their ideas about constitutional government. And as we explored their debates, you may have wondered to yourself why it seemed to be the case that these principles that the founders thought were so important, like states' rights and federalism, the separation of powers and checks and balances, and bicameralism. Why are these principles so little understood and so little regarded today? Why do we just not really understand them or talk about them or appreciate them? Well, I'm going to hold to you that progressivism is one of the reasons, if not the biggest reason, as to why this is. Progressivism offered a reevaluation of founding principles. Progressives wanted to create a vast and powerful administrative state, which would be based on bureaucracy rather than representative government. And they sought for the administrative state to make decisions through the procedural forms of direct democracy, where voters don't vote for a representative to make decisions on their behalf, but rather voters make decisions themselves in things like referendums and initiatives and recalls. And so direct democracy and administration, we're going to come back to this at the very end of the lecture. Today, there's very little outcry when the federal government does all kinds of things that the founders didn't want it to do. And we've also come to think that pure democracy isn't really that bad. Notice the language we often hear about how the founders were bad because they were undemocratic, right? As if it's totally unreasonable to believe that majorities might sometimes violate the rights of minorities, which is the extent of the founders' fears of democracy. We've come to regard majority faction as something that's not really a problem anymore. And so I mention all this just to say that the progressives were a big reason that there has been this change in the public mind. The progressives, because of their emphasis on pure democracy and their very serious attack on the American founders and their principles of republicanism and constitutionalism, they helped to establish something new in place of the old consensus about politics. The progressives, I should mention, they were not just intellectuals, right? This was true of the founders as well. The progressives didn't just sort of think theoretically about what government should do. No, the progressives were often very successful politicians, as you noticed from the last slide, which had pictures of two different presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, key leaders of the progressive movement. And so progressives accomplished a lot, not simply at the level of theory, but also at the level of practice. This particular book I have a picture of by Murray Rothbard on the progressive movement, and it has this old political cartoon that seems to be grumpy about the progressives, right? Because it associates them with all these different policies: prohibition, cartels, the Federal Reserve Board, collectivism, World War I, the income tax, government regulation, these kinds of things, right? And while this is a very negative cartoon, the truth in it is that the progressives were successful at changing our very Constitution. And so several important progressive amendments to the Constitution passed under their watch. This includes the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, and the 18th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment is the Federal Income Tax Amendment. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators, so no more do the states have a voice in the federal government, but simply the voters choose senators on their own. The 18th Amendment is the Prohibition Amendment. All of these different amendments reflect different aspects of progressive philosophy. The federal income tax reflects their fears of special interests, because before the income tax, the federal government raised most of its money through tariffs, and often the perception was that the government imposes tariffs on goods that will help certain American corporations, and that this basically is getting business and government too closely connected. But the 16th Amendment also gives the federal government a vast new source of money and revenue, because if it can tax your property directly, the sky is the limit to what the government can do, because it can get as much money as it needs for whatever programs it needs to do. So the 16th Amendment, a kind of big government amendment, you could say. The 17th Amendment and the direct election of senators. This is about pure democracy. It's about reducing the filters on majority rule that the Constitution imposed. Remember, the Senate was supposed to offset the House of Representatives and be a more deliberative institution that represented the states in our political system. And so the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment helped to totally alter the federal structure of our system and shift the balance away from the states and towards the federal government. The 18th Amendment and Prohibition. This is a little different in some ways, but the ban on alcohol. This was something that might seem foreign to us today insofar as modern progressives often criticize conservatives for their moral beliefs about banning abortion and things like that. And so we don't sometimes see the progressives as moralists. But no, the 18th Amendment reflected this strand of progressivism that was deeply moralizing and that wanted to bring heaven down to earth, you could say. Prohibition was seen as one crusade in that direction of social reform that would make the world a better, happier place. Now, the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. This is sometimes attached to the progressive movement. I think that's a bit of an overstatement because conservatives and progressives alike, there were conservatives and progressives alike who supported this amendment and conservatives and progressives alike who opposed the women's suffrage amendment. Wilson, for most of his career, was against women's suffrage until it finally became inevitable and he kind of tepidly threw in with it. Theodore Roosevelt, for his part, was pro-women's suffrage. So I think the 19th Amendment is a little harder in some ways to connect to progressivism insofar as conservatives like Coolidge and Taft and some others at this time also supported the women's suffrage cause. That seemed to just be a larger national debate about what women should be in our society. Should they be political or should they be family-first women who leave the voting to their husbands? But nonetheless, you could perhaps say that the 19th Amendment reflects the progressive belief in expanding majority rule to new voters and new people. If it was connected to progressivism, that would be where it is. And so all of this is to say that progressivism has had a major impact on the Constitution we have today. And additionally, if that wasn't enough, the theory and practice of the modern bureaucracy and the welfare state, this dates back to the progressive era, which wanted to bring the heavy hand of government down on business and get it more and more under control. So at the level of ideas, progressivism is pretty important because it was the first movement to explicitly reject the principles of the American founding and the limited government principles of the Constitution. Remember that when we were going over the anti-federalist federalist debate, and I often emphasized to you that even though these guys were debating the merits of the new Constitution, I often emphasized to you that the two sides basically agree on the core premises of constitutionalism and republicanism and limited government. Their disagreement, the anti-feds and federalists, was over whether the Constitution would advance those causes. No one at the time of the founding was calling for the repudiation of constitutional government or republicanism. None of them believed in pure democracy. They disagreed on what the best way of realizing these principles was, with the Federalists seeing more value in aristocratic republicanism and nationalism, and the Anti-Federalists seeing more value in a more democratic mode of republicanism that had states' rights at its center. But at the end of the day, no one was talking about an administrative state complemented by direct democracy. Limited government and republicanism were the aim of both of these movements. George Washington was a Federalist, and Patrick Henry was an Anti-Federalist. But both of them believed in liberty, and both of them believed in the principles of the American Revolution. Neither of those men would want anything to do with the progressive movement. Now, you might look ahead and say, well, what about the Civil War? Wasn't there a debate? Wasn't there a disagreement with the founders on that? Well, when you look at it, not totally. At most, it was a partial critique of the founders. If you study the debates leading up to and then including the Civil War, you see that Abraham Lincoln of the Union and Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, both of these guys believe that they are following founding principles as they understand them. To the Union, founding principles were the founders' anti-slavery morals. Founding principles were the need for a strong union, right? Whereas to the Confederacy, they often pointed to things like the states' rights principles of the founders. But very few people were just attacking the founders. There were a few fringe extremists, kind of radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, and extreme pro-slavery intellectuals like George Fitzhugh that did try to criticize the Constitution and founding principles. But these guys were not widely liked, even in their own regions. They were seen as weirdos. And to the extent that people at the time of the Civil War did criticize the founders, it was really only over the issue of slavery. There were not very many people, if anyone, who articulated essential disagreements with principles like checks and balances, federalism, or limited government, right? The debate was over slavery and how that aligned with these principles. So when we get to the progressives, we see that this situation has changed completely. Now we see a group of people who believe that the doctrines of the founding are no longer good or practical for modern times. Theodore Roosevelt, in his 1912 speech on the New Nationalism, he calls for us to recognize, quote, the right of the people to rule. He wants to break down all the checks against pure democracy. And he even goes so far as to condemn the founders for their belief that majorities can be tyrannical. He says, no, we don't have a tyranny of the majority today. And we probably didn't even have it at the time of the founding. No, the only tyranny we got to worry about is the tyranny of the minority, the tyranny of the special interest groups. Now, this is not just Roosevelt's opinion. Woodrow Wilson, his Democratic opponent in 1912, so he's running against Roosevelt. But nonetheless, there's alignment on this basic rejection of the founders. Woodrow Wilson gives a famous speech in 1912 called What is Progress? And he argues that to be a progressive is to reject the founding principles, because the founders were too committed to an outmoded principle of limited government, one that hinders the advance of historical progress and the growth of the state. We're going to see John Dewey also appeals to this line of reasoning. These principles of limited government, Woodrow Wilson said, were rooted in the scientific ideas of Isaac Newton, which had been overridden in the progressive era by the evolutionary ideas of Charles Darwin. So Woodrow Wilson says, just as living beings, living creatures have to evolve and adapt with the times in order to have the survival of the fittest, right? You know, the kind of Darwinian rhetoric and language. So too do political systems and constitutions have to evolve, adapt, grow, and change. So to be a progressive is to evolve American life and American political culture away from the founding principles because they are holding us back. And so we're going to see the progressives, they not only criticize the founders, they also believe they have a better way forward for the American people. So to look at this, let's look at John Dewey. This is a reviewing essay about the nature and character of progressivism. So John Dewey, in this essay, The Future of Liberalism, delivered in 1934. So notice this is actually in the New Deal era rather than the original progressive era, but he is one of them. He's one of the old progressives just writing at the time of the New Deal. And Dewey was one of the most influential philosophers of the original progressive movement. And he had a great impact not only in changing the way we understand politics and government. No, he also had a major impact in transforming the way Americans thought about education. Some of you may go on to study education in college, get a bachelor's or master's in education or something, and you can look forward to reading some very dense and very dry and abstract essays by John Dewey, who was an important theorist of American education. So I will spare you quotes from his educational writings, but the long and short of his educational philosophy was he stressed the need to educate the youth for democratic citizenship. So sounds good in theory, right? But it turns out that democratic citizenship means something different to him than it would mean to many of us. And some of this actually comes out in his essay, The Future of Liberalism, which we'll talk about later. So to him, democracy and relativism go together. We're going to talk about this. He wants to educate citizens so that they'll be free of dogma, so that they'll be free of orthodoxy, and so that they'll go to the polls and basically just experiment with new ideas and new policies all the time. He doesn't want citizens to go to school and to be committed to the ideas of their fathers and mothers or the principles of the founding. No, he wants to take them to school, and they need to come out of school with modern, cutting-edge ideas that will help us to overthrow tradition and old ways of thinking. So we'll talk a little bit about this whenever this comes up in his essay. So at the level of theory, so going back to his politics, Dewey was important because he was one of the main thinkers who helped to repackage liberalism with progressivism. Before Dewey and before FDR, these two things were seen as totally different. After the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and the end of World War I, progressivism was basically in bad odor with the American people. It was associated with moralizing statism and crusades to make the world safe for democracy. Remember that during Wilson's presidency and World War I, he basically made it a crime to criticize the government, right? And so that was progressivism to many Americans in the 20s, in the era of Harding and Coolidge. So Dewey understands that the progressives have a bit of a PR problem. The overreaches of early progressives like Wilson had perhaps left their policies in a state of basically not being very popular with the American people. And so what he wants to do is make it sound like progressivism is really just a new kind of liberalism. And so this is where we get the association of liberalism with big government. This is from Dewey's original unity of liberalism and progressivism. So you have to remember that before people like Dewey, liberalism had usually been associated in the public mind with individual liberty, with democratic government, with founding principles, constitutional rule. These kinds of things were associated with liberalism. And so Dewey is kind of crafty. He understands that if you take this language of liberalism, what American in their right mind is going to say, well, I don't like liberty, right? You know, every American likes liberty. The problem is Americans disagree about what liberty entails. And so basically what Dewey wants to do is take this language of liberalism and imbibe it with the idea that basically big government is the agent of protecting individuals today. And so we're going to see how he redefines liberalism in order to make it compatible with progressivism and its emphasis on activist government. And so in next week's lecture, we're going to see FDR does much the same thing. Dewey and Franklin Roosevelt are both two of the major reasons that during the New Deal era in the 1930s, liberalism became known for association with big government. And again, this is actually very, in some ways, surprising, because before these people, liberalism was seen as the classical liberalism of the Enlightenment. It was something like what Alexander Hamilton talked about in his Farmer Refuted essay. Remember, the idea there was the purpose of government is to protect individual rights, and limited government is the best way of protecting individual rights. The primary threat to individual rights is arbitrary government or state overreach. This is also the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, classical liberalism. And so the liberty that is focused on here is negative liberty. It's liberty against the state, right? And so the founders were classical liberals in this sense. But they were also Republicans because they believed that a limited government that was based on popular rule would protect the common good and allow citizens to live fulfilled lives. And so when Dewey is talking about the new liberalism, he's suggesting that this old liberalism is no longer adequate today. So the classical liberalism has got to go, and we've got to replace it with a new liberalism, which we could call progressivism, progressive liberalism, or neo-liberalism. All these things are sometimes attached to it. And so this is his goal here. He wants to articulate a new understanding of liberalism. So, let's see, that quote is a little too soon. I want to read a quote of his from The Future of Liberalism. He says, "The emphasis of earlier liberalism upon individuality and liberty defines the focal points of discussion and of the philosophy of liberalism today. This earlier liberalism was an outgrowth in the late 18th and 19th centuries of an earlier revolt against oligarchical government, one which came to its culmination in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And so his point here is that the old liberalism was basically connected to resistance to monarchs. And usually it was the middle-class business owners, it was the, Marxists later would call them the bourgeoisie, again, kind of the middle class who owned property and they had a stake in society. It was these people that didn't like the kind of arbitrary decision-making of the big monarchies. And so these people wanted new restrictions on government. And this is what helped to bring about the Glorious Revolution, the English Bill of Rights, and then later the American Revolution. These kinds of revolutions, according to Dewey, were based on this view of negative liberalism, or a negative liberty. But notice that when he praises, or whenever he talks about the classical liberal tradition, he never says it's true. In fact, he says the opposite. We're going to see he criticizes the classical liberal tradition because he thinks that the liberalism of the 1600s and the 1700s, it was not actually based on these permanent truths about human nature that great minds could grasp. Notice that he speaks of natural law as something that, well, they held to it. He doesn't say we should hold to it. No, far from it. Actually, natural law is a problem that's got to be overcome. And so the real reason that you even have the emergence of liberty is because of the unique historical situation. You have dissenting Protestants, you have these business owners, and they're concerned about the arbitrary power of the monarchy, and they want more freedom to engage in trade and practice their religion without worrying about what the king says. And so they dressed up their theories of government, Dewey believes. I don't believe this, but Dewey believes they dressed up these theories of limited government in the language of natural law and human nature. And they were, in truth, only responding to the circumstances of their times. So limited government, this is not true. It's not true in the sense of it's not true. It's not permanently true. It was something we needed in the 1600s, but which has outlived its usefulness. And so, make no mistake, Dewey does say that this old liberalism had its uses. It helped to pull down the authority of the kings. It broke the back of monarchy in Europe. And so it had a kind of helpful, destructive tendency. But there were serious issues with the way this theory of liberalism, this classical liberalism, was packaged. This early liberalism, as Dewey presents it, was articulated in a way that was absolute, that was dogmatic, and that was rigid. It said that negative liberty, so liberty against the government, individual rights have to be protected because God gives them to you. These kinds of ideas. These principles, this old liberty or this old liberalism made it sound like this is the only way of thinking about liberty. It didn't see that individual liberty could be threatened by things that were not kings and things that were not governments. And so you see what he's trying to do is he's trying to prepare the way for us to accept government as an agent of liberty rather than as a threat to it. And so Dewey's problem is that liberal thinkers like John Locke, they didn't just say that limited government was useful for their time, but instead they argued that it came from unchanging and permanent natural laws about the world and about human nature. You read the Declaration of Independence, for example, and it speaks of how you have unalienable rights that government is always bound to respect and defend. If government is not protecting these unalienable rights, and note unalienable means they're rights that don't change. They're rights that are not granted or given to you by society, but they're given to you by God, and so they're permanent. Well, if a government isn't protecting these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then you can overthrow it, as the founders did in the American Revolution. And so the long and short of it is that according to this classical liberal theory, the unalienable rights that government has to respect, these are not true only in 1776, but they're true for all time. Government has a kind of permanent purpose, no matter what year you live in, no matter what country you live in. There's certain eternal truths about politics that we ought to recognize. And so while Dewey is willing to accept that these arguments had their uses in basically tearing down the old authorities, he thinks that they severely curtailed the ability of later generations to define liberty for themselves. Dewey wants to see the new liberals focus not on negative liberty against the government, but on positive liberty. So sometimes you hear modern progressive liberals talk about the right to health care. Well, this is a great example of a positive liberty. It's the idea that actually you're free because government gives you something. So rather than negative liberty, which is you're free because the government leaves you alone, you have freedom of speech because it doesn't restrict you from speaking. Positive liberty is the idea that to be free, government has to basically interact with you and give you things, right? And so the right to health care is an instance of this positive liberty mindset. And so Dewey wants us to see government not as a threat to our liberty, but rather as its agent. So government is our friend. Government is our helper. We don't need to worry about it anymore. Maybe we did in 1776, but in 1934, we understand democracy more. And so we don't need to be fearful of government anymore. And so this is the basis for this kind of a progressive liberalism and this new understanding of liberty. So one very important feature of this thought, one foundational concept here that helps us to make sense of what Dewey is saying, is his view of history. He has a very high view of history, which is basically typical of all the progressives. As he puts it in one sentence, quote, "The fundamental defect of the old liberalism was its lack of perception of historical relativity." In a later sentence, he writes that liberalism is committed to the idea of historic relativity. It knows that the content of the individual and freedom change with the times. And so this is another restatement of what I was just talking about. The old liberalism was flawed because it suggested that liberty always requires limited government. And we know now, as progressives, as progressive liberals, that activist government is the true agent of securing individual liberty. The new threat is not government. The new threat is business, corporations, and even the family can sometimes be seen as a threat by the progressives. So when he's talking about this idea of historical relativity, what is he saying? Well, this is a basic concept that underlies all the progressive thinkers, including Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Croly, and Franklin Roosevelt. So this is not unique to Dewey. It's ubiquitous at the time of the progressive era. So this is the concept of historicism. I've said something briefly about this in an earlier lecture, but this is where we really need to make sense of it. Historicism is foundational for understanding what the progressives are all about. Historicism is the idea that all people are governed by history. All people are prisoners of their historical moment. It's not the ideas of people that make history, rather it is the history that makes the ideas. History moves forward and circumstances change, and this moves individuals to behave in certain ways and to rationalize their behavior in the form of ideas. And so again, it's not the ideas that are changing history, it's the history that's changing the ideas. And so the reason this is not just quibbling, right? This has major implications for politics and even for religion. So you may think, according to the historicists like Dewey, you may think that you have access to permanent truth about political life. So you might think with the founders that all men everywhere have unalienable natural rights. You might think that limited government and constitutional principles of checks and balances are based on permanent principles of human nature. But when you say that, you're basically blinded by delusion, Dewey and historicists would say. Because you're really just speaking as an American who has been imbibed with the principles of your historical age. The spirit of the age has guided you to this belief in the sanctity of the Constitution and unalienable rights. And in truth, unalienable rights don't exist at all. Rights come from society, not from God. And what is the main agent of social action for the it's government. And so this is why one progressive, whose name is Frank Goodnow, a contemporary of Dewey's, Frank Goodnow writes in one place that Europe has the right idea. And this is a direct quotation, by the way. I'm not putting words in his mouth. He says, Europe has the right idea because they believe rights come from government and not from God, like we do in America. And so that's what the progressives are all about. History is the basis of rights. Society and government are the basis of rights, not God, not eternal natural laws. I like the way Hegel, who was one of the most important philosophers of the 1800s, explains historicism. He was one of the most important influences on the rise of historicism. Hegel wrote that every man is a slave of his time. And so again, you can never access permanent, eternal truth about political life. History is always the story of change. And so to the extent that ideas exist, they're always based upon historical contingency. It's never the ideas that are doing the moving in of their own right. And so, as you can imagine, historicism is closely connected with relativism. Dewey himself is pretty clear about this because he often says that we believe in historical relativity. And so he recognizes the connection between these two things. So what's the connection? Well, we all know as Christians that relativism is a serious problem in our culture today. Because according to the relativists, there are no absolute moral truths. Morality is just about every individual's unique perspective. So what's true for you may not be true for me. I heard one relativist philosopher by the name of Auguste Comte. He once wrote that the only absolute is that everything is relative. Now, I think that's kind of an irony that he speaks of, he gives us an absolute statement there, but at least that's how relativists think. There are no absolute moral truths. Morality is about individual perspective. So historicism is basically a corollary to this. It's adding to this because, like the relativist, it believes that there's no unchanging or eternal basis for morality. There are no eternal moral laws or rules that are given by God that apply for all people at all times. And so if this is true, the final authority has to be history, because history is the most powerful agent in the absence of God or in the absence of any kind of basis for eternal morality. And so historicism and relativism, as you can imagine, they both end up being extremely hostile to Christianity, especially traditional expressions of Christianity. So kind of orthodox views of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. So it may be no surprise to you that many of the progressives, including John Dewey, were atheists. They rejected religion altogether. They saw it as an outdated relic of a bygone time, and they believed that it had been disproven by science and displaced by historical progress. Now, there were some progressives who remained attached to religion. So Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, for example. But they didn't remain attached to traditional Christianity. No, they were theological liberals and religious modernists. And so their belief was that basically to make religion viable in a progressive age, we have to update it to suit it to the needs of our times. So much like they view the Constitution as something that has to evolve and adapt and change, these progressives were willing to say things like, well, let's get rid of traditional Christian doctrines like the inerrancy of the Bible, the actual truth of the resurrection of Christ, and the literal idea that he performed miracles, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ. So all these foundational doctrines, right, the progressives would say, well, these kinds of things have got to go because we don't want Christianity to be about orthodoxy or doctrine that focus on individual salvation before God. Rather, we want Christianity to be about social action. We want to reframe Christianity as a kind of social religion that tries to save society and care for the poor. And so spreading the gospel becomes basically not important to this new social gospel movement. The gospel is actually save society, not save souls anymore. And so I would argue that these progressives, what they're doing, they're not updating Christianity, they're rejecting Christianity. Because it's impossible to have Christianity without a Christ, and it's impossible to have salvation without an atoning cross. By calling for us to repudiate such core doctrines as the Trinity, the resurrection, and the literal atoning work of Christ on the cross, they're calling for us to embrace a religion that has no Christ. They're calling for us to basically have a sort of humanitarianism dressed up as Christianity, right? And so you can see historicism has this terrible implication not only for politics, because it has this corrosive impact on the idea that the founding and the Constitution is true today, but it also has a terrible impact on religion, right? Whenever you hear people say, oh, well, we've got to just change the way we understand the Bible to make sure that it's right with LGBT stuff, for example. Well, that's a kind of historicist argument here. So what are some other interesting implications of Dewey's argument here? Well, Dewey is concerned about the way the new conditions have basically made the language of natural law and unalienable rights obsolete. He thinks that this historicism that he embraces, it opens up the door for us to be more flexible in our approach to government. Natural law and unalienable rights, these kinds of concepts are too rigid. They're absolutist. And what the classical liberals and the founders didn't foresee was that these principles could actually be agents of oppression. So, for example, in the new conditions of the progressive era, Dewey would say limited government is no longer a help to the individual. It's actually a hindrance to him. Corporations, they can take this idea of, quote, individual liberty and then use it to say, hey, wealth inequality and injustice against workers, that's not a problem. Just leave it alone. Let me make my money. That's the natural law. That's capitalism. Well, Dewey would say that's an attitude that the older classical liberalism can help to justify because of the way it provides a philosophical sanction for the idea of property rights and the need for government to protect property rights. And so what he wants to see is flexibility. He wants us to start to evolve and adapt our political system in light of these new circumstances. And so the threat used to be government, but now it's capitalism. And we have to evolve and adapt with the times. And so this is why Dewey often emphasizes experimentation. This is connected very closely with his idea about democracy, right? He thinks that this adaptation and evolution can only take place if you as a citizen are able to kind of act without the chains and shackles of tradition and fidelity to the founding and fidelity to traditional religion getting in your way. Experimentation based on progressivism and based on scientific principles. This can only happen if you have these kinds of new citizens that are basically imbibed by their education to be hostile to traditionalism. The Constitution is a threat. It's not a document to embrace, but it's a problem that has to be overcome. Because what does that do? Well, that shuts down this experimentation that Dewey wants. It makes it impossible to do a bunch of new things fast. Because remember, the political science of the Constitution is worried about guarding property rights. It believes that, as Madison puts it in the famous property essay, which is a striking contrast with Dewey's ideas, you have a property in your person, and you have a right to the fruit of your labor based on natural law. And so the Constitution is based on the idea that property rights and unalienable rights are permanent, and they don't change with the times. Furthermore, the Constitution imposes all of these limits on majorities in order to make it harder for action to happen unless it has a very broad consensus of the whole American society. Well, according to Dewey, these things are a problem. They prevent experimentation and they prevent the kind of activism that government needs to have in order to protect us from capitalism. And so this new social system that he envisions is going to be something that's very distant from the old founding principles. Remember, he calls the founding principles absolutist. He calls them individualistic. And they have to be replaced by something based on this historicism and experimentalism. Pragmatism is also associated with Dewey, the idea that we got to just keep trying new things and see what works. And so what does this new system look like? I want to look at a quotation that's of interest here. So, Dewey wants government to take a hands-on role creating a new kind of individual. It should no longer be hands-off and willing to let individuals simply make their own choices. Rather, as he puts it, liberalism, and he's here referring to this new liberalism, liberalism knows that an individual is nothing fixed, given ready-made. It is something achieved, and achieved not in isolation, but with the aid and support of conditions, cultural and physical, including in culture, economic, legal, and political institutions, as well as science and art. Liberalism knows that social conditions may restrict, distort, and almost prevent the development of individuality. It therefore takes an active interest in the working of social institutions that have a bearing, positive or negative, upon the growth of individuals who shall be rugged in fact and not merely in abstract theory. It is as much interested in the positive construction of favorable institutions, legal, political, and economic, as it is in removing abuses and overt oppressions. So this language here is somewhat dense, as is common with Dewey, but I want you to look beyond the kind of abstract, cerebral, and intellectual language here and get to the core of what he is saying. So despite the kind of arcane way that he puts this concept here, what is he saying? Well, at the risk of being too sort of imposing modern politics on Dewey, I have to say that this passage is an early example of what we would today call wokeism, or maybe political correctness. So how does that work? What's the connection here? Well, at its core, what he's saying is that government and the centers of American culture, such as the universities, the schools, the entertainment industry, which was just emerging at the time that he was writing this, these things have to have a cooperative relationship in shaping individuals who are liberated from backwards and traditional modes of thinking. And when you break it down, this is the heart of what wokeism is. This is why people complain about it who are so more conservative-minded. So when Disney shoehorns Marxism, for example, to take a recent example of this, when Disney shoehorns Marxism into its remake of Snow White, or when it tries to make us think that white people are the root of all evil by basically saying that no characters that used to be white, like Snow White, can continue to be white. Well, these sorts of things, they seem to be sort of subtle indications of Disney just kind of trying to be more inclusive, right? That's the immediate way we think. But actually what they're trying to do is they're trying to socialize new progressive individuals who are more sensitive to the sins of capitalism and racism, especially against minorities, right? And so there's a deeper meaning here than just what's going on the surface. So wokeism is about this kind of cooperative relationship between government and corporations and other centers of culture, like schools and universities. They're cooperating in trying to help shape individuals who are basically opposed to traditional ways of thinking. And so you gotta come to hate the founding, not appreciate it, for example. You gotta come to resent the founders because they were bigots and racists, for example, rather than have any piety and any respect for the kind of ancestral ways. And so the traditional moral values and religious beliefs are a threat to the new liberal individualism, and government has to rein in these traditional moral values and religious beliefs. Notice the way he puts it. Liberals have to be proactive in overthrowing those, quote, social conditions that may restrict, distort, and prevent the development of individuality. So what is he saying? Well, he's saying that traditional Christianity, for example, according to Dewey, as well as modern progressives, traditional Christianity is a threat to progressive individuals that believe in freedom, because Christianity teaches that there are eternal truths, and it denies the omnipotence of the state. It refuses to make government God. And so traditional Christianity is one of these backwards views that has to be basically scrubbed out of the minds of people through education and through democracy. But it's not the only traditional perspective that's a threat. Business owners who appeal to a traditional concept of the free enterprise system, they are also backwards and have to be re-educated to understand the social conditions of the new liberty. And so at the end of the day, what he's saying here is that censorship and the silencing of conservative opinions are actually not tyrannical. They're means of helping you be free. So try to understand that. Try to wrap your minds around that. He's suggesting that to be free, there has to be some kind of restriction on what you can think and what ideas you can be exposed to. And so that's an interesting element of Dewey's liberalism. Governments and corporations make it harder for conservatives to promote, he wants to see progressive governments and corporations work together to make it harder for conservatives to promote their ideas. And he doesn't see this as being unfree. Rather, he thinks that conservatives are antisocial because they reject his concepts of progress, right? And so when government censors conservative beliefs, they're only silencing antisocial individuals and making it easier for other people to live in light of this new individuality and new democracy. And so, again, just try to wrap your minds around that. You will be forced to be free by having restrictions on the kinds of conservative ideas that you can be exposed to. If you believe conservative things, you're not free at all and have to be altered by education and by democracy to believe a more enlightened way of thinking. And so one final point I want to mention about this essay of Dewey's is his argument that progressivism, progressive liberalism, and radicalism are not really as different as people sometimes suppose. So he's quite clear about this. So he thinks that radical ideologies like fascism, socialism, and communism, notice the way he actually speaks of Mussolini here as kind of one of the radicals that he's sympathetic with, so fascists too. Well, he thinks that the radical ideologies, the main disagreement between progressive liberals and radicals is a disagreement in method, not in fundamental ends. So Dewey says the radicals, they are very much right when they criticize existing social conditions and try to liberate individuals from the oppressions of capitalism. But where Dewey says there's a serious disagreement is in their methods. Liberals reject the inevitability of political violence, according to Dewey, and they embrace instead the capacity of the scientific method and political experimentation to bring about a better and more just society. And so it's a disagreement in method, but not an end. And so this suggests to us something about Dewey's radicalism. Progressivism is not just a kind of moderate way of thinking, but at the level of theory it has more in common with socialism and communism and perhaps even fascism than many proponents of it would like to believe today. And so Dewey himself says that. That's the interesting thing here. It's not just me, the grumpy conservative, criticizing Dewey, but rather it's Dewey himself saying that there's a radical edge to progressivism that we are simply refining, right? Because we are better advancing the ends that they want to pursue, like the end to injustice and exploitation through big government. And so wrapping things up, these are points that I'm going to develop more in next week's lecture. So just some final thoughts here. There were certainly some differences between some of the progressives on various policy issues. But ultimately, the disagreements between progressives like Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Croly, Theodore Roosevelt, and John Dewey, the differences are not as important as the similarities. Dewey was very much on the same page with all the other progressives in calling for this system that combines pure democracy with an administrative state. So remember that he wants to have a more democratic and experimental form of government that allows majorities to rule. Well, this is very much the rhetoric of progressivism. This is very much what they're always all about. They want to break down representative government. They want to break down checks and balances and embrace something more like direct democracy. But paradoxically, they also unify this emphasis on direct democracy with something like bureaucratic government. The administrative state is another word for this. And they believe that sometimes when the people express their will in this democratic fashion, so the people go and vote and say, this is what we want to do, the progressives believe that ultimately the bureaucracy is going to be a better way. It's going to effect the will of the people better than the people themselves can. So how did that work? Well, it works because these bureaucrats are going to be agents of progress. The bureaucrats are going to be appointed by the president, and sometimes even not appointed by the president, sometimes simply chosen through independent commissions and these kinds of things. And these bureaucrats are going to be scientists and public policy experts who know better than the people do how to realize the conditions for progressive democracy. And so the expansion of the administrative state is a necessary corollary of this progressive model, because to the progressives, the bureaucrats are going to be people who can make decisions without a view towards partisanship or self-interest. But rather these administrative agencies, these administrators like the EPA, like the FTC, the alphabet soup agencies, These are going to be disinterested servants of the public good, who, uncorrupted by elections and political machinations, are always just going to make their decisions based on science and progress. And so understand the paradox here. On the one hand, the progressives call for pure democracy. They attack the idea of the tyranny of the majority and seem to want a sort of just pure majority rule system where the voters get their way and there's nothing to stop them. There's nothing to slow them down, no checks and balances or anything like that. So on the one hand, there's a kind of populism about that. But on the other hand, there's this sort of deep-seated elitism here, where they seem to be very distrustful of traditional politics, and they want more and more political decisions to shift away from representative institutions and to unelected bodies in the government. They want us to trust the science, trust the experts, right? To put it in the language of the COVID days. That's very much attuned to this administrative state theory, right? They want more of the decision-making to shift to these unelected bodies like experts, bureaucrats, and even judges, who the progressives felt would have a better way of making decisions for the public good because they wouldn't be bogged down by elections and by politics. And so to connect this to your paper coming up, the rise of judicial activism, the rise of living constitutionalism, these ways that the courts have acted to basically transform our constitutional system in ways that no one ever voted for, right? This is a legacy of this progressive philosophy. So, to highlight one important example, abortion rights are nowhere in the Constitution. Even proponents of that idea would say that. But the progressives justified the Roe versus Wade decision because they said, well, we can't trust elected legislatures in the states or even in the Congress to make decisions about abortion for themselves. If we allow the states to decide, then a lot of states are going to restrict abortion. And what the progressives want in this case is actually not democracy, but abortion rights. So basically, if the people make bad decisions, they need to be corrected by judges and bureaucrats and other unelected elites. And they can be corrected through this process of simply interpreting constitutional rights in this loose, progressive, experimental, and evolutionary way. And so understood in this way, the Supreme Court becomes this kind of ultimate sort of a judicial expression of this administrative state philosophy, where they want to shift policy and politics to elites in these more distant bodies. And so next week we're going to develop these concepts and see how FDR and the New Deal represent a kind of triumph of the progressive movement. So thank you guys for listening to this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you later this week. Hope you have a great evening. Bye-bye.